Van Helsing, Bram Stoker's monster hunting genius. Van Helsing is the example I think of when I talk about the core fantasy of a monster hunter being someone whose knowledge is their greatest weapon against evil. Of course, movies and television shows about Van Helsing and hunting monsters are an excellent resource to draw on for D&D inspiration. Whether you're looking for gruesome creatures to challenge your players with, or you're a player who wants to be an aspiring monster hunter yourself. So let's take a look at what Dracula and their arch nemesis Van Helsing gets right and wrong about monsters and monster hunting. Not that one.
Van Helsing.
Yeah, not that one.
My name is Van Helsing.
Not that one.
His name is Van Helsing.
Some say you're a holy man. Others say you're a murderer. Which is it?
A legend.
What are we dealing with and how do I kill it?
Wait, somebody's talking about a mediocre action movie from the early 2000s. I have opinions to share.
This is a shock to me! It's Super Geek Mike from the Super Geek Mike channel. What are you doing here?
Ben, I heard you were going to talk about the Hugh Jackman Van Helsing movie, and I had to jump in with the hottest take of 2004 and say, that movie is kind of bad.
Oh, but that's upsetting.
True. Yeah, okay, true. It definitely doesn't hold up today. The special effects in particular. But I think it's an example of a lot of monster movies of admittedly questionable quality that still have evocative imagery and ideas that can be stolen for your D&D campaign. And the special effects in your players' heads will hopefully be a little bit better than this movie.
No, 100%. There is a ton to steal from this movie. There's a lot of plot in this film, and you could easily use that as the inspiration for an entire D&D campaign.
Check out our video on the Super Geek Mike channel for ideas about creating a narrative for your D&D campaign. While we're here, we're going to talk about the monstrous imagery, mechanics, and ideas for monster hunting that can be stolen for your D&D campaign. So get out your carving knives. Let's see what trophies we can butcher up.
First, before we talk about the parts of this movie that you can steal as inspiration for your D&D game, I want to talk about the opening scene, because it's actually kind of good. This opens in black and white like a classic Universal monster movie, and we see Dr. Frankenstein bringing the monster to life right as a mob of angry villagers arrives at his door. And then Dracula shows up.
Count, it's just you.
The way all the monsters are presented in this movie, for the most part, is honestly, I think, very cool. Dracula in this first scene is honestly very intimidating. There are camera tricks used to make him feel like he's supernaturally fast, despite the fact that he's got a very calm demeanor. Lightning flashes reveal his true vampiric face, and even allowing himself to get skewered on a sword is his way of proving that he cannot be killed by mortal means.
The monster wakes up and backhands Dracula into the fireplace, and as Dracula climbs out of the fire, he regenerates, and there's something very cool about a CGI regeneration scene presented as if it's an old school monster movie. It really works for me. And this kind of lurid description and detail of violence and action can be really effective in setting the imagery of your own gothic horror game. The monster takes Frankenstein to the windmill, and the villagers give chase, and they end up burning the windmill down with the monster and Dr. Frankenstein inside. And then Dracula and his brides swoop in from the sky, and all the villagers cheese it. But Dracula and his brides are anguished and horrified at the loss of Frankenstein's monster.
I love the actors' movement during this moment, flowing down from the air. There's something about the costume being really flowy and the effortless motion that the actors have. The brides in particular move together in a way that's admittedly pretty cheesy and melodramatic if you're not buying into it, but still has this flailing creatureness to it that sort of makes them and their wailing cries feel inhuman. The way that they group together, they almost feel like one creature with three heads rather than than 3 distinct creatures. That's what can make monsters scary, when they appear human, but behave anything but human, as if there's something else existing beneath their skin.
Let's talk a little bit more about how the monsters are depicted in this film, because there is a lot that we can steal for our gothic horror D&D games. First, let's talk about the werewolves. Every time somebody transforms into a werewolf in this movie, they literally rip the skin off of their body, revealing the werewolf underneath. And when they transform back into their human form, they do the same thing.
This is honestly my favorite style of werewolf transformation in any movie or media ever, and it's the way that I've always described my werewolves transforming in the D&D campaigns that I've run. Conceptually, they're just so violent, and thematically, they're appropriate to the idea of like releasing the beast within. Describe that the werewolf's fingernails fall out first to give way to their claws growing through, and that their jaw seems to break and open wider than it should be able to. Blood spatters across the floor as the werewolf's skin is ripped away and its fur is still matted. The smell of iron driving the predator mind instantly wild. I also love the small detail that Velkin like climbs the wall backwards the first time we see him transform, which is completely needless, yet gives the moment an added atmosphere of the strange and supernatural.
This isn't just something that you can steal, this is something that we've already seen stolen to great effect. For those who are watching Campaign 3 of Critical Role,
you see these claws start to crawl out of his fingers, and as they do, the blood drips out of them. My shoulder pops out, my back cracks.
The werewolves that appear transform in a very similar method, and I don't think that's a coincidence.
Mechanically, this movie has me wondering whether you could give werewolves a climbing speed. It looks super cool, and it makes them feel very deadly and preternatural, because nowhere the party can go is going to be safe from the werewolf that can just climb up after them. I also like that Velkin appears to have his werewolf powers even when he's not transformed, in terms of his strength, his supernatural strength, and his ability to climb. And these things could all be added to a werewolf stat block to make them an even more intimidating and formidable threat to your party.
We could also talk about the vampires, but a little disclaimer before we do. The vampires look kind of bad in this movie.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
The idea is sound, but it looks so bad, I don't feel good talking about it. The vampires turn into big bad people. You get the idea. And no one else has anything else to say about this, and if you cut to somebody else...
Look, I am gonna disagree with you here slightly, mainly in regard to Dracula's brides. The CGI of the time is pretty rough, especially when mixed with practical effects of the brides transforming from their actress selves into their CGI selves, but the ideas are sound, and honestly, pretty untapped in 5e. I mean, imagine giving Vampire Spawn a flying speed in your campaign.
Well, that's not good.
A pack of them can already be pretty dangerous to a party because of their regeneration ability, so what if they could pick players up off the ground and fly them into the air to feed on them? They can really split the party up. Dracula's transformation into beast mode at the end of the movie looks pretty abysmal, I'm not gonna lie, you're totally right. But it's an example of a vampire motif I don't think we see enough of in D&D specifically, and that's vampire shape-shifting. Admittedly, we have mist and tiny bats, and I think some obscure stat block for the vampire might be able to turn into a wolf, but nothing like the monstrous bat that could be the vampire's one true form. Imagine a legendary vampire encounter like the Great Worms from Fizban's Treasury of Dragons. When the vampire is reduced to 0 hit points, it doesn't die, but instead regenerates into a new, more monstrous, more deadly stat block as it loses its patience with the party. Or maybe you give the vampire stat block a rage-like ability, or a werewolf shape changer ability that comes with a new, more aggressive set of abilities that go alongside its more monstrous looking visage.
Let's also talk about monsters as NPCs that the players will interact with. Can you look to this movie as a point of reference for character voices or mannerisms? Well,
Are you wretched undead?
Too bad. So sad.
Please don't kill me.
Why not?
maybe? The problem is that the performance for Dracula is so broad, and the movie is just not campy enough to support it. Because of that, a lot of the performance falls flat, and a lot of Richard Roxburgh's scenery chewing is just distracting and kind of bad. The best use of Dracula is in the opening scene, and from then on, everything he and the brides are doing feels a little stale. Like, for example, at many points during the movie, the vampires move extremely quickly, and it's supposed to be scary, but...
Did I scare you?
No?
Honestly, the best version of that is in the opening scene. That opening scene also has one of Dracula's few genuinely funny line readings.
I would kill myself before helping in such a task.
Feel free, I don't actually need you anymore, Victor.
Still, there are some good bits from later in the film as well. There's a great moment when somebody shouts at Dracula, and he just sort of dances a waltz to himself. Like, the screams of his victims are just music to him. On a similar note, no pun intended, when Dracula is trying to intimidate Van Helsing, he talks about,
I can tell the character of a man by the sound of his heartbeat. Usually, when I approach, I can almost dance to the beat.
Yes, I love both of those moments. To me, they speak to Dracula's apathy as a creature that's been alive for almost 400 years. He has this real gallows humor to him. I also really like when Vulcan at one point in the movie says,
I would rather die than help you.
and Dracula responds,
Oh, don't be boring. Everyone who says that dies.
Dracula's brides are bad. Honestly, there's not much to discuss here. There's a lot of potential to these characters, but for a more interesting interpretation of them, you should just watch the Francis Ford Coppola Dracula movie. That's not exactly the most nuanced take of those characters. He doesn't remake the wheel, but at least they're not cackling and shrieking for the entire runtime like they are in this film.
I agree that Francis Ford Coppola depicts the brides subtler, less action villainy. Their threat is more psychological. But what I like about Dracula's brides in Van Helsing is the ideas the movie has in the details given to them. The graphic way that Marischka's body kind of decays and falls apart when she is killed. And the fast healing that they have when they pull crossbow bolts out of themselves. Those small details you can give to describing vampires in your campaign as well. To be honest, I don't even hate their cackling and shrieking, as I think of them almost more as creatures. They are vampire spawn rather than fully fleshed out characters.
That's really what they ought to be, exactly. Also, the fact that we're calling the Francis Ford Coppola Dracula movie subtle says a lot about this film. Now let's talk about the design for Frankenstein's monster.
Who's the monster here?
Because it's actually kind of interesting. On the back of his skull, you can see his exposed brain crackling with energy and encased in glass. There's a green glass orb on his chest as well, over his heart, which is also crackling with electricity. There's a lot of other mechanical sections on his body, and the shape of his skull is a very deliberate reference to the classic Frankenstein design.
Absolutely, no notes. He is kind of ugly.
I don't know if you've looked in the mirror lately, but you kind of stick out to the crowd.
I particularly like there's a moment where he gets knocked up against a wall and his face kind of pops open and you can see the mix of bone and flesh and machine inside before he's able to kind of click it back into place. Perhaps as a flesh golem is taking damage from the party, you could have chunks of them fall away like this as well, so the party know that they're doing damage to it. Or maybe if you've got a party member who's a revenant or a returned or some sort of flesh golem themselves, they can have advantage to intimidation checks when they pull a piece of them open to scare whoever it is they're interrogating.
So Dracula has this army of faceless minions who wear gear that covers their full bodies. No idea what that's about.
So I actually looked this up. Anna calls them
Duerge,
which Hugh Jackman's accent butchers into and most of these words sound like pretty much made up nonsense.
Dracula's servants, industrious but extremely vicious.
what these dudes are meant to be is Duergar, which are dwarves from Norse mythology. In D&D, they live in the Underdark and were enthralled to mind flayers at one point and are not typically associated with vampires. I suppose their representation in this movie sort of fits as tinkerers who have likely constructed and operate the machinery that is present in Dracula's castle, but they are pretty poorly done and pretty replaceable and could have been kind of called kobolds or goblins with no real difference made to the movie.
And if there wasn't enough going on, Dracula's main henchman in this film is Igor, who is in this movie.
Igor! Yes, master. Why do you torment that thing so?
It's what I do.
But he sucks.
Igor sucks!
He's played by the same actor who plays Benny in the Mummy film, and he's kind of just doing the exact same shtick, only this time he's covered in a bunch of prosthetics to make him look deformed. It's not good. I would love to tell you that there are a bunch of characters you can steal from this movie for your own games, but there aren't. Most of the characters in this movie are kind of bad. But the one exception, the one character who would make a great NPC in your games, is the Undertaker in the Transylvanian Village. He's great.
Strangers don't last long here.
He says this while he is taking the measurements of our main characters. That's a great detail. You should lift a character like this directly for your gothic horror games. And then they ruin this character by having him try to kill Van Helsing, and then the werewolf immediately kills the Undertaker like 45 minutes into this film. Oh, and his explanation for trying to kill Van Helsing?
It's just my nature.
No. This sucks. You could maybe have him try to kill Van Helsing because Van Helsing is hunting the werewolf, and the werewolf killing people is good for the Undertaker's business. But honestly, I don't think the Undertaker should try to kill anybody. He should be the one person in town that nobody messes with. The monsters don't bother him, and the civilians don't bother him because he creeps them out, but they need him. So he just walks around town, measuring everybody for their coffins, asking them about their epitaphs, and he asks the main characters how the monster hunt is going, but he doesn't really seem to care one way or another whether it goes their way or not. He could almost be like the Greek chorus, commenting on the action in town.
I see the Wolfman hasn't killed you yet.
Don't worry, he's getting to it.
They were also going to make a Transylvania TV show spin-off of this film, and seriously, don't kill this character. What are you doing? But you can do what we just talked about and have this character in your game, and I think your players will love him. Or at worst, they'll love to hate him.
There is also an alternative take where the Undertaker is a monster living in the village, but folks don't tend to bother it. It may be an undead creature or even a flesh golem itself, but all it does is find the dead in the village and bury them in the graveyard. It could be the dead Undertaker half remembering their role in life. And while terrifying folks in the village, they let it go about its grisly work because nobody else wants to be responsible for burying the bodies. Burying the bodies also stops worse monsters like ghouls from coming into the village hunting for carrion to feed upon. So, with our monsters pretty well established in this movie now, let's move on to Van Helsing himself. Portrayed famously by Hugh Jackman in the early days of his Wolverine career, Van Helsing was an attempt to boot up a new action horror franchise. The studio wanted a young action hero for Van Helsing with weapons and gadgets and a nerdy sidekick called Carl for some reason. Not so much the stuffy old Dr. Van Helsing with his spectacles and his books. So just how good of a monster hunter is Van Helsing in this movie? Not very good.
Vampires, gargoyles, warlocks, they're all the same.
Yeah, they're all the same. This is a terrible line for a professional monster hunter because the point is that monsters are not all the same. It's why you need a trained monster hunter, because vampires, werewolves, and golems can't be killed by just a skilled swordsman. It takes specialized knowledge. So a monster hunter needs to know the difference between a werewolf and a warg and a transfigured vampire to be an effective hunter.
When you fight a beast, knowledge counts as much as your silver sword. At the very least, you ought to be able to tell a ghoul from an owl ghoul.
I think I know why this line is here. or rather, why this line exists. See, Van Helsing's character arc ostensibly is learning that some monsters are not evil. And that starts here when he describes the fact that all monsters are basically the same, that they're just that. They're monsters, they are inhuman, they're not something you have to worry about. We actually see this reinforced when Anna's brother shows up, who is a werewolf, and Van Helsing ignores Anna's cries to not hurt and kill him.
He's not your brother anymore, Anna!
This is further challenged when he meets Frankenstein's monster, who is apparently a good man and not just a mindless monster.
Even if you somehow kill Dracula, Rome orders you to destroy Frankenstein as well.
He isn't evil. Do they know him? Have they talked with him? Who are they to judge?
Which rocks Van Helsing's worldview. Finally, this is fully tested when he himself gets bitten and infected with lycanthropy. He knows he's going to turn into a werewolf, and he's finally in the position of so many other people that he's hunted. He is turning into a monster. He is losing control despite being a good man.
Which is honestly a fantastic character arc for a monster hunter to go through. From all monsters are mindless killers to, oh, now I see that not all monsters are necessarily mindless killers, is a strong character arc. And the monster hunter slowly turning into what they hate is a classic with strong thematic elements of identity, self, guilt, and regret.
Of course, they still screw this up in two major ways. The first is that if you're trying to make the point that not all monsters are evil, having Van Helsing turn into a werewolf and kill Anna at the end of the film kinda ruins your point. And second, and this is to what Ben was saying, this line is in the complete wrong scene. It would be one thing if he was talking about the ethics of hunting monsters when he's talking to Anna or the people who run the Vatican, but he's not. He's not talking about ethics at all. He's talking about his equipment. He's receiving his cool monster hunting gear. Talking about how all monsters are the same when you're getting your awesome gear doesn't just make you seem less smart, it makes you seem less cool. He's not somebody who carefully chooses the equipment he needs depending on the monster he's going to fight. He's just someone who says that all monsters are the same, and that's kind of boring.
On first viewing, this line to me seems to have the intention of making Van Helsing seem cool and kind of masculine in comparison to his sidekick Friar Karl. And Van Helsing kind of says, the subtext being, "Shut up, nerd," you know what I mean? With that reading, this makes Van Helsing seem not just mean, but completely inept at his job.
The same year this movie came out, we got the first Hellboy movie, where he has a team of people who come along with him with boxes full of equipment, full of different monster hunting gear that you use depending on what monster you're going to face. The next year we got the Constantine film, where Keanu Reeves never solves a demon problem the same way twice, and we got Supernatural, where the boys drive around with a trunk full of gear that you use depending on what monster you're fighting. Now, yes, usually they would just end up using shotguns because shotguns are cool and TV is expensive to write, but the implication was there. Research matters. Knowing what you're going to fight and face matters. I would actually argue that by putting this line in the equipment scene, this is the first moment that dooms this Van Helsing franchise.
Here are a bunch of cool monsters I could fight in future installments, but don't worry, they're all the same. I don't need to employ any critical thinking when I face them.
Okay. Then why would I want more of this? You just told me it's all going to be the same. If I want a story where every monster is fought with the same few pieces of gear, I can get that from Danny Phantom or Pokemon.
The 10 million volt thunderbolt.
Pikachu makes it look easy.
Finally, let's do a quick review of the monster hunting tools and gadgets that Van Helsing uses in this movie and how they could be applied to your D&D campaign. Could these be presented as loot to your player characters, or maybe there is a specific class for 5e that intends to use monster hunting tools like this, such as the Grim Hollow Monster Hunter class? Admittedly, a lot of the tools that Van Helsing uses are just guns. Van Helsing uses a crossbow with a drum magazine, 2 medieval-looking revolvers, and at one point just a straight-up shotgun to blat vampire spawn out of the sky. A character that could evoke this specific feeling for you as a player is taking any gunslinger-like class and then just taking a 2-level dip into Monster Hunter to get the expertise that you need in hunting a specific type of monster. Van Helsing uses holy water and blessed weapons, which is always cool, and something other fighters may consider to be naught but superstition until the party cleric or monster hunter avails them of the monster fighting properties that holy water has. You may prefer to use silver bullets if your prey is susceptible like a werewolf. Van Helsing also uses a blow dart gun, which is cool, I guess. Maybe if it was filled with some sort of monster poison that could momentarily stun them, or maybe reverse, like the monstrous transformations of a lycanthrope. Actually, that's a really cool idea. Grappling hooks are both functional and could be used as some form of grappling weapon. And we also have Van Helsing's pump up spinning razors, which to me seemed super lame when I saw them early in the movie. I'm sure many YouTube weapons experts could and probably have mentioned that I doubt these would be particularly effective weapons, more so than just a simple dagger or a short sword. I mean, they have no reach, they look awkward to wield, and honestly, they don't really look that cool either. Until Van Helsing throws one like a ninja star and just nails Igor to a wall, at which point they are freaking awesome, and you should definitely have spinning razor blade ninja stars for your monster hunters in your campaign. Honestly, it is one of the straight up coolest parts of the movie, and I'd completely forgotten about it until I saw it again. And lastly, there is the sunlight bomb, which is used to deal with a large crowd of vampires. And this thing is honestly very cool and could make for a very cool consumable magic item to get the party out of a dangerous situation. It could inflict radiant damage in an area of effect similar to like a fireball, but it could also just only do damage to those creatures with sunlight hypersensitivity like vampires, and maybe it only blinds other creatures, but this makes it much safer for the party to use and much more specialized. And that is the monster and mechanics inspiration that we were able to carve out of this early 2000s monster movie classic. But it is only half of the ideas Van Helsing has to offer for aspiring game masters and D&D players. So Mike, where can folks find you and the other half of this video?
Well, Ben, if people want to see me talk about the plot of Van Helsing and how we can take some of the story elements and put them in our D&D game, you can head to the Super Geek Mike YouTube channel.
You can find that video on Super Geek Mike's channel by clicking directly here, and make sure to subscribe to his channel while you're over there and give him some support. He does great stuff. Or you can click on this video down here if you want to learn about the Grim Hollow Monster Hunter class for 5e and you're an aspiring monster hunter yourself. Otherwise, share this video with someone you think will like it, and I will see you next week.